Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chinsia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. So we've been on a bit of a witch discovery, haven't we, at the moment? We talked about the Pendle witch trials a couple of weeks ago, and I've been exploring quite a few witches in my spare time. I'm really interested in the history of witchcraft in general, and I thought, you know what, let's start, not at the beginning, because it goes back further, but let's talk about probably one of the most famous quote-unquote sorceresses or witches that most people who are interested in Greek mythology and general mythology know of, and that is Circe, or Circe. We'll come to that in a minute. Now, there's a lot of history around the figure of Circe. Circe obviously exists largely, as you probably know, in the Odyssey, and also in the Argonauts. But we're going to be talking about Circe and the Odyssey and talk about the history and lore and archaeology of that figure within Greek mythology, rather than go into the extensive history of how she metamorphosed into a figure of witch and how she became associated with witchcraft and all that jazz and paganism. So we will be getting to that in another video, but today we're talking about the origins of Circe herself and what archaeologists and researchers have gathered together, how this figure was formulated and where exactly that she came from. Is she an Indo-European, or is she more of a mixture of Asia Minor kind of figures across the world? We will see. We'll explore it together. So before we get into talking about Circe, let's take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. As you know, I have built all my main business websites over the past few years with Squarespace, including my current Lady of the Library website, and I love how intuitive and easy it makes website design and layout. I don't need to know anything about coding, which has made other website platforms incredibly frustrating to use, but with Squarespace I can simply drag and drop my content where I want it, and if you're a creator who wants to expand your revenue stream, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy for you to monetize your content and expertise in a way that fits your brand. Squarespace member area lets you sell your courses or classes to your followers, and Squarespace also has an inbuilt email campaign option where you can collect email subscribers and convert them into loyal customers, all from your website. And the built-in analytics feature gives you insight into who's visiting your site, traffic sources, the time they spend on your site, most read content, audience geography, and so much more. So if you want to expand your business this year or just build a beautiful site for your blogging leisure, then go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lady of the Library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring today's video. And now let's talk about Circe. So, for those maybe unfamiliar with the Odyssey, let me tell you about this. So when Odysseus meets Circe in book 10 of the Odyssey, he is thoroughly lost. Joseph Campbell remarks that Circe is more than a mystical creature that the hero encounters. She is Odysseus's mystagogue, whose services to the hero are pivotal in the poem's progression and the hero's understanding of the dangers that await him on his venture home to Ithaca. The hero is already shattered and depleted when he arrives on her island. Many of his men have been lost to the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians, the tribe of man-eating giants, and he foolishly loses more on Circe's island, though not in such the same violent fashion. So Circe is the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and Perse, an Oceanid, whose elemental nature, combined with the divinity of Helios, grants Circe the powers to loosen the bonds of form and steer a transformation. Circe's home is a blend of both stately glory and haunting sinisters. It is laced with the aura of magic and gold, and her home is made of stone, polished smooth on all sides, a building whose construction would be worthy of the status of a Mycenaean king. And that status of building is actually found nowhere else in the Odyssey. Circe exists within an ontological niche concerning Greek mythology. She lives like a queen, but she's a goddess bound to the earth, not Olympus like the other gods. And though she is divine in nature, as Odyssey explains, she is a dread goddess of human voice, meaning she's accessible to humans through language, though still powerful and frighteningly unapproachable. We as readers don't experience Circe directly. Rather, we hear of Odysseus' encounter with her as he relays the tale to the assembled nobility on Nausicaa's island. Circe lives, Odysseus explains, not on Olympus with the other divine figures, but on an island close to, quote, where the dwellings and dancing floors of early-born dawn are, and the rising places of the sun. Now, the Old Greek name for Asia Minor, Anatolia, is derived from the word Anatolai, which is the word for rising places. This, combined with Circe's kinship to Aeetes, who figures as a king of cultures in the Argonaut myths, which is geographically on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, strongly implies Circe's island would reside in that location. Odysseus explains that the island seemed to be inhabited by tamed wolves and mountain lions. Though it's never explicitly expressed that these creatures were once human, it's just often assumed in classical reception. However, the captain of Odysseus' ship actually knew of Circe, and his name is Eurylochos. And he warns Odysseus and the rest of the crew that Circe will turn them all into swine or another wild creature if they disturb her. Regardless of his warnings, the men still approach Circe's house, not Odysseus. He hangs back with Eurylochos. And Circe lures them in by her shrill singing, which she performs whilst weaving ambrosial fabrics from her great loom. Now, the word is often translated as shrill, and if you've read Madeline Miller's Circe novel, you will see that she plays on this a lot. She calls it like a shrill, horrific sound that the gods can't stand, and she's kind of seen as this monstrous croaking voice. But it's interesting, but the word that Homer actually uses before the translation into shrill is actually liga, or liga, and this is the same word that Homer actually uses to describe the wails of the Trojan women and the playing of the Demodokos, which is the harper of the Phaeacian court, whose music actually brings Odysseus to tears. Therefore, though we respond negatively to the term shrill and imagine it to be quite an awful sound, the term can be interpreted as something which actually sounds deeply human in nature. Circe therefore welcomes Odysseus' men into her home and serves them drinks and cheese and honey and barley meal. However, in the strong premium wine, she actually drops a pinch of vile drug that transforms Odysseus' men into swine after she sways her wee little wand or rod over them. Why Circe turns the men into pigs, Homer does not actually say. In Madeline Miller's Circe, we see Circe's transformation as a form of defence against being, unfortunately, sexually assaulted, which she has been a victim of in the past. Judith Yarnall argues that Circe's drugs actually bring about what can be interpreted as a, quote, the primordial feminine acting according to its very own nature, and making manifest the comparative inferiority of individual male being. It suggests the way in which the ego consciousness can be easily ambushed and overwhelmed in those who do not take seriously the bodily and instinctual basis of their own natures. You see, the ancients saw primal power as feminine because life originated with and was nourished by the female sex. And I'm saying this in terms of ancient Greek conceptualizations of sex and gender, which is why I'm using heteronormative and cisgender terms as appropriate, but this is no disrespect to the nuances of these labels thanks to advanced modern science and changes in social norms and languages. So please forgive the old-fashioned terminology, but we cannot project contemporary terms of understandings of sex and gender onto ancient understandings of them. Anyway, when Odysseus' men don't return and Eurylochos expresses his concerns, Odysseus goes in search of them. But he's intercepted by Hermes, who gives Odysseus a herb called moly, which will counteract Circe's magic. Interestingly, Circe is prepared for the encounter with the hero, because Hermes also came to her to warn her of Odysseus. So when Odysseus drinks the wine and does not transform after she waves her wand, and then holds a bronze sword over her head in a feigned threat to kill her, Circe takes his knees in her arms and surrenders to him, a gesture which is actually also adopted by Priam in the Iliad when he comes to Achilles to ask for Hector's body. Now, the difference between the two is that Circe cannot be killed by Odysseus, as Priam can with Achilles. She does not take to his knees to beg for her life, but instead it's a form of power play and of attraction. It is in this position that she actually invites Odysseus to her bed, and he accepts, because why wouldn't he? He says yes to everyone. Now, unlike most men who have intercourse with an immortal goddess, Odysseus never suffers for his relations with her. She never lies to him or threatens him with harm or impotence like a lot of goddesses do with mortal men. Instead, he and his men are restored, and they live peacefully on her island over the winter months to restore their health and get ready for their travels. In some versions of the myth, Odysseus lives with her for years, and even fathers children with her. Homer doesn't actually reference them having any children. Odysseus, however, does actually start to forget about Ithaca and his wife Penelope, until one day his men demand him to remember his homeland, and Odysseus remembers, and actually, interestingly, returns the symbolic gesture to Circe by holding her knees and begging for her to send him homeward. Now Circe, unlike Calypso, does not wish for him to remain against his will, and she grants his request immediately. She tells Odysseus that he must seek the counsel of Tiresias in the underworld, and she eases his fears of entering the underworld by undertaking the catabasis. By the end of Book 10, Circe resumes her remote and self-sufficient status, and supplies the men with gifts, a black ewe and a ram whose blood they will need to summon the dead. Odysseus sails away and follows Circe's detailed instructions until he returns to her island again in Book 12. She welcomes them, feeds them, waters them, and then tells Odysseus alone about all the dangers that he will encounter for the rest of his journey home, including the Scylla, the Charybdis, and the oxen of the sun. And my dogs are playing. And she gives him very detailed instructions on how to avoid falling prey to any of them. Have you noticed how many immortal Greek heroes actually completely rely on the advice and guidance of women to defeat the monsters and actually survive? You know, we have Ariadne and Theseus, Medea and Jason. It seems like behind every great immortal hero is a woman who told him what to do to succeed. So where does Circe actually come from? In terms of Greek mythology, it's quite interesting because there is a lot of iconographic details in Homer's epic concerning Circe, which connects her to Mediterranean traditions of goddesses' worship, particularly Anatolia. However, obviously, because there's actually no firm existence of both Homer as an author and the origins of the Odyssey, all associations are largely speculative, but they're interesting nevertheless. So let's start with her name, Circe, or technically Circe, spelled like this, likely comes from the word kirkos, which means falcon or hawk, or sometimes circle. Now, the Neoplatonists placed emphasis on her name relating to circle, but as you should all know from following my channel, just because an ancient man said so doesn't mean that they were right. If we look at the word circle that Homer uses in the poem, he actually uses the word kuklos, except for the one time when he uses the word kirkos. It would seem that Circe's name, therefore, is actually more relevant to hawks than circles, especially considering her brother's name, Aeetes, which derives from the word aetos, meaning eagle, and the name of her island, Aea, may be based on the West Semitic word for the word hawk, Ea. If you can hear the doggies playing in the background, they're having a whale of a time. Now, birds have been long associated with divinity, not just in Greek mythology, but across Europe and Asia Minor and throughout religions to this very day. Birds have long been considered symbolic of the human soul and the spirit of life. We see this a lot in Greek associations between birds and gods and goddesses. Hera's peacocks, Aphrodite's doves, Athena's owl, Zeus transforming as an eagle, etc. Interestingly, hawks, like vultures, are flesh-eating birds of prey that exist in prehistoric art as omens of death. Around 950 BCE, the Neo-Hittites used the hawk and the buzzard to represent the goddess Kubaba, and the Phrygians, who resided around west central and southern Anatolia circa 750 BCE, associated the hawk with their primary goddess Cybele, and the Lydians, who lived shortly after them, associated the hawk with their Myrmidonian dynasty of kings, because Gyges, who founded the dynasty, believed that his family had a special relationship with the goddess Cybele. Now, Cybele is often referred to as the mother of gods, and she was the sister to the Ephesian Artemis, who is the familiar figure, as I'm sure you're all aware of, the Ionian Greeks. The site of the Temple of Artemis of Ephesus is actually at the mouth of the river of Cayster, and that was excavated by the British between 1906 and 1907. During the excavation, they found numerous small figures of hooked-beaked birds, which they identified to be hawks. The leader of the expedition, D.G. Hogarth, concluded that the bird figures were placed there intentionally and likely as offerings dedicated to the goddess. Also at the site was an ivory statue of a kore, or a young priestess, carrying a hawk atop a long pole on her head. It has since been dated to the mid or early 7th century due to the presence of coins that were found within it, meaning that the Ephesian Artemis was strongly associated with hawks circa 650 BCE and likely earlier during Homer's time. Though Homer never connects Circe with hawks, or any flesh-eating birds for that matter, Apollonius Rhodius tells us of a strange cemetery in the plain of Circe where the Argonauts pass by on their way to Aeetes' palace. Now, in the cemetery, it's said that the bodies of the men were actually hanging from the willow trees, and presumably their bodies were being picked up clean by flesh-eating birds. An image which actually harks back to the vulture goddess of Catalhuyuk, a goddess indigenous to Asia Minor, circa 7,250 to 6,250 BCE. This incredibly ancient vulture goddess was believed to control the gates of death and rebirth. In one mural that was excavated around the 1960s by James Mellard, in a Neolithic city in south-central Anatolia, we see the goddess herself depicted as a vulture with human legs, whilst the bodies of the deceased are left out for their flesh to be picked away at vultures before their bones can be buried. That, in my opinion, is pretty badass. So, okay, what about the tame wolves and the mountain lions of Circe's island? Well, in another settlement excavated by Mallard in the mounds of Catalhuyuk and Hakilah, several stone and clay sculptures depict the goddess with a leopard or mountain cats, and she is known as the Lady of the Beasts. The oldest statuettes details an impressive female figure giving birth while seated on a throne flanked by felines, and there's another sculpture from Hakilah that shows a woman fondling very playfully with a baby leopard. The leopard was regarded as the most fearsome creature in the forests of south-central Anatolia, and was also the hunting rival for the locals for like deer and all that jazz. So this juxtaposition with the most feared animal with symbols of fertility seems to demonstrate the goddess's power over life and death. The Lady of the Beasts superseded the vulture goddess over time as religious imaginations evolved. But the mistress of animals was widespread across the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, so it's likely that there were numerous locations for such a female figure and the feline. However, the strongest image we have of a figure that seems to foreshadow Circe comes to us from Babylonia, circa 2300 BCE. Now, she's a nude winged goddess who stands on the haunches of two reclining lions and flanked by owls, and we've actually discussed this figure before in my video on the sirens, as many believe that she's an early interpretation of the harpy due to her taloned feet. But there's nothing fearsome about this figure. And why it's a lion? Well, the lion was a very popular creature amongst the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, as demonstrated by their famed Cretan seal, which depicts a bare-breasted goddess standing atop a stylized peak, with paired lionesses raising themselves beneath her. The goddess with her tamed beasts was a traditional symbol for many different goddesses throughout Greek tradition, but our mind usually immediately goes to Artemis, after whom I'm named, may I add, hence why she's actually the figure at the end of every video. The earlier Artemis that's associated with taming animals is actually known as Artemis Parthenos, and that was associated with being actually married more than she was virginal. And her image of being the chaste virginal huntress was actually developed much later, and it would seem that it was actually the epic poets that formulated this image of her rather than religious and worshippers. And we see this more unvirginal Artemis figure actually represented in Circe. So what about the wee little pigs? Why did she turn them into pigs rather than, I don't know, goats or sheep, which are other things that used to be sacrificed? Well, you know, the reputation of pigs as greedy, dirty creatures goes back a long way, so most people assume that Circe transforming the sailors into them made perfect sense in terms of depicting a powerful woman stripping men of all dignity and honour. But it's not how the ancients used to see pigs at all. Pigs are incredibly Greek in terms of ancient symbolism. They were Demeter's animal and occupied important roles within rituals that celebrated her, such as the Eleusinian Mystery and the Thesmophoria. These rituals go back long before any written record. However, whilst we don't know much about them because there's no written records, many terracotta figurines of pigs and women in headdresses have been found in the Corcyraean grotto that predates the worship of the god Apollo at the sanctuary. These ancient figurines are believed to be associated with the Thesmophoria festival, which honoured Demeter during the sowing of the new crops in October. The festival aimed to promote fertility, both for the field and for the women who performed the festival, which lasted 3 days and 2 nights. This was the only time that these women were actually given a chance to leave home and live apart from their partners and children for a few days. And it's actually pretty gross, so prepare yourselves. You see, the women would carry the rotting carcasses of suckling pigs, which they'd throw into their deaths into caves or ravines several months before. So you can imagine that these remains were absolutely rancid by the time October came around. And then they mixed the carcasses with seeds before placing them at the altar. Disgusting. The Eleusinian Mysteries also had pigs as a star of the show. Now, this festival took place in September, and on the 3rd day of the ceremonies, the Hierophant of Demeter, who had proceeded along the sacred way of Demeter from Eleusis to Athens, was called down to the sea. They took with them young pigs, which they washed and then sacrificed because the blood of the pig was believed to be the purest blood of them all, and thus had the power to cleanse and rid the initiate's soul of hatred and evil, thus making it the finest gift to be offered to the gods of the underworld. Thus, the Greeks of Homer's time would not have associated pigs with uncleanliness as we do today, which, interestingly enough, was actually an invention of Judaism. Even Apollonius Rhodius spoke of the pig having purifying powers. And when Jason and Medea go to Circe after murdering Absyrtus, they sacrifice a pig and cleanse themselves in its blood. Lovely. So as we can see from all of this, Circe is a composite figure of many different elements of terrifying but admirable deities across Asia Minor, far more than she is of any Indo-European figure. And as I said earlier, there's much more to be said about Circe, particularly regarding her evolution into discussions of witchcraft and sorcery. But I think I'll leave this video here today because there was a lot of dense information in this one. So thank you so much for watching today's video. Thank you so much to my Patreons for making this channel possible, and also for my sponsor, Squarespace, today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and sharing or even subscribing, and I will see you very soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.